Hello. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to T-Space Architecture Lecture Series. This is the third in a series of 8 public lectures organized by T-Space within the framework of the Architecture Residency program. My name is Irini Tsahrelia. I'm a practicing architect and an educator in New York, currently instructing and directing the Architecture Residency program for T-Space. With me is Maxwell Funk. Hi, Max. Max is also an architect and the residency host and administrator. And our residents are joining us on our panel from all parts of the world. They will be leading the discussion and Q&A session later. We have with us Reggie Mays, Alexander Kern, Megan Pisarczyk, Yolanda Wen, and Brian Hartman. Welcome. Our residents are all young professionals and students in the field of art and architecture with background in music and philosophy, and they have joined the architecture residency program to experiment with design and push a much needed critical thinking today. The residency program is a 25-day intensive. It takes place once a year, every July, and the umbrella theme for this year is called Transformation of Consciousness. And I want to take a moment and thank Steve Pulemot, Silvan Engineers, the Al Held Foundation, and the building in Rhinebeck for very generously supporting our residents, every single one, with either a full or partial scholarship this year. We are very proud for that, and thank you. And we're certainly welcome your support as well for future scholarships to support the residents and make the programming available for the general public. Please take a look at the chat. You will be seeing notes, notifications, or any relevant links coming in your way. Just a few words for T-Space for those who are new in our audience. T-Space is an initiative of the Stephen Myron Hall Foundation. It focuses on art, education, design, and ecology. And in addition to the residency program that I introduced, it offers events that are called the Synthesis of the Arts. They focus on art, architecture, poetry, and music. And one such event is coming up on Saturday, the 17th. It's called Raptures and Reconciliations by Anthony Titus, music by Anthony Braxton, and poetry by Kathy Park Hong. You can find the links to register for those events as well in our chat. And most of the programming this year, same as last year, is taking place virtually. Yet T-Space Gallery will open its doors in person for visits by appointment only, starting late August until the end of September for limited hours during Mondays. Again, you can find the details in the chat and on our website. Now I would like to welcome our main guest speaker for today, Yolande Daniels, who is joining us live from Los Angeles. Hello, Yolande.
Hello.
Yolande Daniels, it's a pleasure to have you here. Yolande is the founder of Studio Sumo West in Los Angeles and the co-founding design principal of Studio Sumo in New York. The work of the studios consists of institutional and cultural projects in education and the arts, as well as housing and design research. The design research directed and authored by Daniels explores techniques of encoding or erasing race and gender in the construction of objects and environments to reinforce systems of authority and control in order to reveal spaces and narratives of resistance and autonomy. Daniels is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome and a recipient of the Rome Prize in Architecture, as well as the McDowell Colby and the Independent Study Program of the Whitney American Museum of Art in Studio Practice and Cultural Studies. Yolande Daniels has taught architecture in multiple universities at the University of Southern California, Columbia University, University of Michigan, Washington University in St. Louis, Pratt Institute, and City College. She was previously appointed the Rosarian and visiting professor at Yale University, the Silcott Chair at Howard University, and interim director of the Master of Architecture program at Parsons School of Constructed Environments. She is an associate professor in architecture at MIT. Yolande's lecture is titled Resetting the Black City, and it's a real great pleasure to have you here with us, Yolande. We're excited to hear from you. The structure of this webinar is approximately 40 minutes presentation followed by approximately 15 minutes Q&A, which is led by our residents and panelists, and the Q&A is also open to the broader audience. Feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can ask questions throughout the lecture. No need to wait until the end, and we will address your questions. We're excited to have you with Yolande. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Irini, for that very nice introduction. And thank you, Max, as well. It's really nice to meet the students. I'm excited that there's another Yolande here. I've never met one before. Hi. And I noticed too that people do the same thing with your name and call you Yolanda. Anyway, I feel for you. So it's nice to be here. I'm going to just kind of start really quickly thanking T-Space again for this opportunity to present the work. So I am presenting work that I'm going to focus on a research project, but I'm starting with work from, just to give you a little bit of a like a slight overview of what I do, work from the Studio Sumo. We're an architecture practice. It's myself and a partner. We've been practicing since, formally since 2000. That's when we incorporated, but we were working 5 years before that, more informally. And I'm just going to show 3 projects from the office. This is a museum. The buildings are in Japan. We work for an institutional client there, a university that has 4 campuses. This is one campus that's on the outskirts of Tokyo in Chiba Prefecture. And it's essentially a small museum with 3 spaces, a white box gallery, black box gallery, and a glass gallery. And you're seeing here the glass box gallery, which is open to the outside. And I wanted to show these projects because there are 2 streams of work in the office. One is more kind of research and social oriented, and the other is formal. But the 2 streams actually inform each other. So the second project is a dormitory, different campus, same client, Josai International University in Chiba Prefecture as well. And this is a dorm, mixed co-ed dorm, and it's one of the first, there was like in the mid 2000s, a kind of move in Japan to build dormitories. And this was one of the dormitories that was built. Okay, and then these are shots. It's basically a single loaded corridor building, but it has a double corridor where one corridor is open to the air and has brise soleil, and then the other corridor is internal. And the doors for the internal corridor can open onto these balconies to double the space. Great. The third project I'll show from the Studio Mokada Museum of the African Diaspora is in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. And this project, I think I went kind of fast. This project is a very small gallery, only 1,600 square feet, that consists of an exhibition space that's kind of transformable with rotating panels. And the part that I'm featuring here is the reception area, which has the map of the African diaspora kind of realized in 2D and 3D on it. So this project started with how do we materialize, you know, this is the Museum of the African Diaspora. The client wanted a map of Africa, but we actually suggested instead it be a map of the African diaspora. And then the challenge was, how do we materialize that? So what I'm going to focus more on is this body of research I've been doing, Black City, that was at that was just exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It ended in May, this exhibition, and it's a body of research that I've been doing for about 20 years, looking at issues of Blackness, Black space, and how they relate to the city. And part of it is representation, so representational, so ideas about Black and symbolism and metaphors, and then how that gets translated into ideas about space. This research started with the idea of the Black city, actually in England. In the 19th century, that's where the term came from. And it was a term that referred to industrial towns in England that basically belched black smoke and kind of, you know, this pollution and ideas of industry that were negative. And that was kind of counterposed with the ideas about the white city that was realized in the Columbian Exposition in the United States. And so I kind of looked at the idea of the Black city from that, like this idea of a city with negative attributes to it, and looked at it in the context of the US specifically and how race plays out. So this project consists of a dictionary that I'm compiling of terms which are places, place-based narratives, and specific concepts and phenomena that are kind of, that explain the Black city. So there's a dictionary, and then there's a series of dictionary plates that are actually inspired by medieval books of hours, which were these small kind of personal prayer books that had images and texts, and largely they were prayers to saints. So this is a shot from the installation that shows a construction, a model, and then drawings on the wall. So the drawings consist of the dictionary plates and then maps that locate each of the places in them. And the maps are 20th century and 19th century periods of Black settlement in Los Angeles. And you can kind of see how the settlement is moving from downtown, basically starting when 1850, when Los Angeles is founded, then kind of moving, I guess it's west, but also south through like the 1950s. And I think I pretty much stopped like after the 60s at this point. So I'm continuing after the 60s now. So more terms, some are specific to California. So every city has general terms that are these descriptors of the Black city, no matter where you are in the United States, like Great Migration. But Free State refers specifically to the idea of California as a free state, or the Archive of the Indies is of the Indies is an archive which talks about the specific settlers of Los Angeles who were largely mixed race people. And that's located in Spain. So that's part of the narrative of Los Angeles. This is one of the maps. This is the 19th century map, and where it's most dense, where it's most dense is showing you, I should apologize in advance because I'm having a little bit of trouble with my controls. So where it's most dense is downtown, where there are these different layers of settlement. And so what I'm trying to show in the map is settlement over time, basically. And so then here I'm just showing different plates and definitions. So Calafia is about the myth of Los Angeles. There was a race plate, which is about the myth of race. And they're basically kind of California stories, general Black city stories, and then place-based narratives. I'm also showing some of the research behind this. So I constructed a timeline as part of this project that was looking at Black settlement, but specifically looking at any laws that had to do with housing. Biddy Mason here is shown because she was a slave who, enslaved woman who actually petitioned for her freedom. She wasn't able to petition herself, but people petitioned on her behalf, and she was freed in 1856. And then she became one of the largest landholders in Los Angeles. So that's why I showed her. But most of what I'm showing here is my research looking at settlement, not just in Los Angeles, but Los Angeles in the context of the United States. So it's kind of looking at, this is looking at contraband camps. So that's like the Civil War, and when African Americans were freed, and they basically were, in addition to Native Americans, they were one of like the largest refugee populations. So there was these two refugee crises from the founding of the country, the Native American refugees with the Trail of Tears, and the African American refugees after slavery. Some of these contraband camps became towns. The people stayed and built them up. One of the most famous is the site of Hampton University in Virginia. So from contraband camps to freedom or freedmen's towns is part of what I was accounting for here. And again, this is the United States. The timeline that you're seeing is mapping both national, but also local, like state events. And so what you're seeing here in the research is this kind of events that affect settlement. And in Black settlement in the 1900s, the events were often violent. And so basically there are court cases which are either for or against the ability for Blacks to settle where they would like to. And then there are acts of violence that are either for or against them settling. So things like you probably heard in the news about Black Wall Street and the kind of burning of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood area in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's one of these cases. Wilmington is another. There was actually a Democratic coup d'etat where the whole government was deposed. The Reconstruction government was deposed, and the town was also burned in Wilmington, North Carolina. And it's another story that's only recently been kind of accepted within the press. So this is kind of the background. What I'm showing here, the images and the quotes are the background for the timeline. My project kind of focuses more abstractly on the timeline of events that happen. And the reason I do that is because I started this project trying to understand the dynamics of race in the city, gentrification. And as I was doing that research, I just found these like curious terms that, you know, concepts that sort of explained racial phenomena, like the color line or glass ceiling. Glass ceilings used specifically to talk about the inability for women to advance beyond a certain point in corporate America. And but these terms were related to specific kind of sociological texts. And what I was interested in is what effect they had on space, and what kind of rules were, you know, kind of like either implicit rules or explicit rules were related to these ideas about social ideas about space. How did it play out in space? So this is work that I started doing as a fellow at the Whitney Museum's Independent Study Program. And I've kind of been developing it since. This map that you're seeing is the 20th century map, and it's kind of looking at like a later part of settlement. So this is World War II. Bronzeville was a town that existed for, I think, about just during World War II when the Japanese were interned in the United States. So basically these towns where they lived, Japanese were not allowed to own property because of racist laws that wouldn't let them, even Japanese nationals, own property. And when they were interned, their property was sitting vacant and the people who owned it wanted to profit off of it, and they were looking for tenants. And in the case of Los Angeles, I found images where they were actually targeting Latin American communities as potential tenants, but there was an influx of African Americans to work in the defense industry because California had a lot of plants and jobs, and so it ended up that African Americans moved there, and Bronzeville was in the footprint of Little Tokyo in between the war years. And it basically kind of became this jazz hotspot in that period. So what's unique about Los Angeles, but also the West Coast, is how it's not just anti-Black violence, it's also anti-Asian violence. And it's written into the property laws, and like, you know, it's written into the deeds through things like restrictive covenants, and it's written into the zoning through maps that mortgages, HOLC, mortgage insurance maps that then, you know, don't enable people to like buy property in certain places or to get mortgages. The other thing that I looked at, and I'm looking at this more now, is infrastructure and the role of freeways in Los Angeles, highways in other cities to kind of prevent like settlement. And one of the ones that I just showed there is, I think that was in the West Adams neighborhood, and there was a court case associated with that neighborhood where the Black tenants, who were all like the Blacks who were in Hollywood movies, they lived in this neighborhood, Sugar Hill. The tenants, I don't think you call them tenants if they own, but the people who own the houses, they were taken to court by the neighborhood association, and they won, but then the freeway was put through their neighborhood. Okay, so now we're in the 60s, and in the 60s, the violence actually kind of turns, where it's African Americans who are then kind of becoming violent and pushing back at the violence against them and demanding rights. And this is about the Poor People's Campaign, which is similar to the March on Washington, part of the 60s civil rights actions that were taken, but it was specifically for housing, like housing rights and better housing and less policing, which is very similar to what I think the recent last year, the recent kind of instability and protests that people were doing. So this model is where all of this research is kind of the timeline research, the research about the settlements is kind of abstractly represented in this model, which is from the top is like the founding of California and the bottom is actually the future. It's in 2-inch segments. Every 2 inch is a decade, and it's basically a graph of this kind of push and pull, or you could say integration and segregation forces in the nation and Los Angeles. And there are two timelines. One is national on one side and the other is local. So it goes pretty much to the present in terms of the laws, like housing laws that I've cataloged here. And this is kind of showing, this image is showing the ends where you can get a sense of the timeline. It's sheets of plexi that are inscribed. The laws are inscribed in them. There are not just laws, but events. So there are events that happen by year, and then there are movements which happen over time. And part of this is to show how movements and events relate to each other. And so this is showing movements engraved on the left-hand side. And actually in the model, this is a test, but in the final model, these are vertical, not horizontal. And then the events, which you kind of see on the right-hand side, are horizontal. Okay. So I'm continuing to work on this project now. In a project that we're doing, my office is doing actually in Arkansas for the museum Crystal Bridges. It's part of an architecture installation there. They invited 6 firms to make housing proposals, affordable housing proposals, but it's an installation in their grounds and it's a housing proposal. So the installation is looking at, it's a house, you know, it's about a house. It's not a house, it's about a house. But then it's also about the place. And the way that I'm kind of continuing this research in this project is by looking at sundown towns. And sundown towns is basically the idea of these places that Blacks were not able to live in. So the sundown town ethos was that minorities had to be out of the town by sundown, otherwise they might be killed. And so Arkansas is one of the cities that was kind of known for sundown towns. And what I'm looking at is the idea of histories of negation. And I'm looking at the Native Americans and African Americans because the 2 timelines kind of run together, although the Native Americans start, of course, before all of the timelines. But that was something that I kind of looked at in the Los Angeles project, but didn't really go into. Another thing I looked at in the Los Angeles project was the intersection of races, like the laws against Asians and the laws against Blacks and the laws against Mexicans. In Los Angeles and cities on the West Coast, they really intersect each other. But for the project, I wanted to just focus on African American settlement. And in some cases, you know, the stories do come out, like the story of Bronzeville, which I mentioned, and other cases which are in the project, you have the overlapping because it's very strong. It's hard to not deal with the overlapping, but so I would like to get to that in another project where I can look at just the overlap more thoroughly. But I felt it was important to just look at Black settlement as a whole. So anyway, so that's the research, the work of the office, and a kind of like look back and look forward. And thank you very much for letting me present.
Thank you very much, Yolande. It's a very dense presentation with information and terms and geographies that demonstrate this transformation of consciousness in a way that our residents are also interested in for the residency project. I would like to maybe ask a question and open it up, of course, panelists and our audience. So how do you think that the research feeds into your design process, from early schematic ideas formulation into actual construction?
Yeah, so I would say, I think there are 2 answers. One, I can answer just by the specific project. So with the Black City Los Angeles project, the way that it worked, I wasn't starting from scratch on that project because I've looked at race in New York and in other places. So I've done other timelines looking at public accommodation segregation. And in that project where I looked at public accommodation segregation, I essentially made a game. In all my other works, I've made games. And the games were a reason, the games were a result of wanting to engage a public in these kind of things that are sometimes difficult to talk about, or like, you know, that are nested or whatever, but engaging people through lightness and through play to then think about things that are deeper, but not, you know, kind of preaching to them or saying this is what it is. And so the games are useful in that way. So this public accommodations timeline project was something that it was a role-playing game. So you would kind of put yourself in the position of a traveler in the past and go to a city. So pick a time in the past, pick a place, go there, and then see what happens, see what laws apply, what laws apply to how you could occupy space. And how we got to that was, the first was just really wanting to engage people in whatever the project resulted in. And the research was a little, you know, so this research looks at laws, a lot of, you know, legal research. It looks at just trying to find out like whatever the rules, or, you know, the rules about space, which often are legal rules, or like zoning rules, things like that, which as an architect, I can't say that that's something that I wasn't trained to do that in school, but in order to find the answers to these questions, those were the kind of things I had to, you know, look at. And then always it's like, well, how does it relate to space? How does it translate into space? And my process is pretty abstract in terms of representation. So it's like, how can it be mapped? How can it be visualized? And sometimes it's a bit of a struggle, like, you know, just kind of lots and lots of sketches and studies to try to capture whatever the phenomena is in, you know, a series of drawings, and then, or like a construction. So the blue model for Los Angeles is very much like with the timeline and the kind of integration segregation index, that's learning from this game, this previous project that I did, where it also had integration and segregation indices, but it was different. It also had a timeline, but it was totally different. And it was mapping, you know, it was actually mapping the dynamics of laws rather than just, you know, mapping the timeline. So I think like over the projects, there are certain things I've learned and formal, in terms of how to represent things formally, how to abstract these social phenomena that have developed over time. So that's like one answer to the question. Then the second answer is that because there are two streams in the work, so the work that I showed initially, like the museum or the dormitory or the reception area at Mokata, like those projects, the way that they're formally represented, that also goes into, it kind of goes back and forth between the research and the buildings or built work, where, you know, there's a lot of lines, right? Lots of lines in the timeline, dotted lines, solid lines, like, you know, ways of representing that then become translated in slightly different ways, but sometimes kind of similar ways in the, you know, like say the Mizuta Museum with its lines, which are lines of light. You know, those lines of light then become like, you know, like the lines of light in the Mizuta Museum were actually inspired by a smaller installation that we did in a, that was looking at, ideas of domesticity in the Third Ward in Houston in like plantation homes. And so there, the lines of light were about evoking these past traces of domesticity in a house, like past walls, past paths. But then in the Zuta Museum, the lines are actually voids that allow light to come in and cast these, you know, shadows and lines of light inside a museum. So that idea was tested in something that had a totally different framework. But when you look at them, they're kind of, you can see they're kind of similar.
That's interesting. And now that you're describing for clay, for engagement, the translation of complex graphs and very complex mapping exercises, I can see the influences even more strongly between your work and your practice, your research. And to that extent, I can take a question from Roni, from our audience for you. So she's asking why abstract representation is why abstract representation in final installations, and what does that suggest in terms of intersection of fine art sensibility and design sensibility?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I don't know if I can actually answer that question. Like, I feel like it deserves more thorough analysis. Like, in part, I think it's because, you know, abstraction, I do think a lot about abstraction. It's something that we learn as architects in our education. We're basically taught to abstract things. And I've often had students who struggle with abstraction, not very many, but when they struggle with abstraction, it kind of, you know, poses the question to me, like, you know, about what we're teaching, and, you know, are there other ways to teach? Because actually there are movements out right now as part of rethinking education to make it more pluralistic. There, you know, there are ways of people who are thinking of, well, you know, can we have narrative be a part of architecture? Can, you know, what other approaches can we have other than abstraction? So that's why I think this is a bigger question. It's definitely something really worth exploring, but I personally work that way. And part of, I think, what's useful for me is that the themes and subjects that I'm dealing with in the social projects are so, they're so heavy and like kind of laden and tangible. And a lot of what I've been trying to do is make things present that are not tangible. So like, you know, history itself is not tangible. These laws are not tangible. And I think abstraction is actually very good for dealing with intangibles. And so that's why I think it's useful for me. I also am very uncomfortable with, because my work started with looking at representation and the way that representations of minorities can be used, and women are used, have been used historically in ways that are oppressive and entrapping. And so I just avoided all imagery as a result of that. And I think just not wanting, unless I was using the imagery in a way that could be empowering, I didn't want to use the imagery. And so that's like a reason when I first started, but I think as I developed the work more, it's about trying to make present these intangible things.
I would like to open it up to our panelists and the broader audience for our residents. Incoming questions.
Yolande, thank you. This is really fascinating. I have so many questions, but I'll try and limit it to try to be concise. Kind of following up on Ronnie's question as far as representation, abstraction. I'm curious what your thoughts are of aesthetics and form that, and even like spatial organization that have such a deep history in imperial and colonial, like oppressive power. And these people that throughout time have not had agency over that. And then using those forms to build now. Like, what does that mean? How do those forms carry that history?
Yeah, I think that is the question of abstraction, because it does carry histories of negation with it. So one of the jobs of abstraction is to kind of erase identification. And that's one of the critiques of it. But I think about that, but at the same time, I think that you can use, I think there is also this kind of like when you put enough lines and colors and shapes on the page or build them, they have like an aura. They have, there's like, I think you can subvert, with everything you can subvert whatever was intended. And so I think that you can evoke these non-tangible things. You can evoke and actually present the exact opposite of what, abstraction maybe was intended to do, by just like, in a way, overdoing it, by like using it. So I don't know. It's definitely, I think that could be, I've often wondered about, that as a critique of what I do, because like sometimes the work is so clean, and it's important to me that it's beautiful, because usually things that have to do with social issues, they're seen as being lesser. And so they don't have to be lesser. It's just that we've sort of said that they're lesser. But if we apply the same intensity to them, they can be beautiful. But then in the Los Angeles project, I specifically used orthographic representation, which is something that I've actually avoided in the past. But I wanted to work in a very architectural way at the Museum of Modern Art. So I didn't want to kind of avoid these tools. I wanted to just see what I could do with the tools of architecture that are often, so like, orthographic drawing is basically, the drawing that's used to survey and map and conquer, right? And so how could you use those tools to tell other stories?
Maybe a short follow-up to that, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on vernacular architecture and nomadic architecture in relation to this. I know that most of your studies have been on the Black experience so far, but like looking prior to that with Native American architecture, just primarily temporary structures. Just kind of curious how that lands into that, like, how we treat these permanent objects with importance, not the temporary ones, like how that might play a role in rethinking how we approach architecture.
Well, thank you for that question. Like, actually, these are really great questions in general, but I think like this question specifically makes me think about the project we're working on right now, which has these two lives, one as an installation for an art museum and the other as a house, for that has some kind of affordability component attached to it. And in my mind, those are two totally different buckets, but we are charged with dealing with them. And so I think in many ways, our approach to the installation, like I would like to think about it, it is something that's temporary. It's something that has like a particular life, and it's part of it. And I think your question makes me think about how, you know, these histories of negation that have to do with Native Americans and African Americans, and this whole idea of migrations, basically they're forced migrations, how the nomad aspect can play into that, I think is really interesting. You know, as like a formal idea. We have in the past looked at vernacular architecture and nomadic architecture, like researching African architecture for a client, the Museum for African Art, and plantation architecture, which is essentially vernacular architecture, shotgun houses, which are actually a lot similar to contemporary you know, studio loft type dwellings, but made out of nicer materials. So I would just say, like, in the proper answer to your question, we look at those things, but they're not like, vernacular is not in a separate bucket, or nomadic. They're just influences and things that we find interesting that can inform our practice. But it doesn't mean that we would, so I would say, like, we're not going to start drawing by hand because it's a vernacular building, which I've seen some people do. Even if we're inspired by it, it just kind of enters into the practice in the way of anything else. But it might inform things so that we operate in a different way. And I think that's where your question makes me think about how, you know, I'm going to meet with my partner after this, and we're talking about this project, and I'm definitely going to be asking about this idea of the nomadic in our installation, because I think that would be a good thing for us to, you know, consider. So thank you.
Thank you.
Can we take a question? There are two questions from the audience. Yolande, you may be able to read them as well if you open up the Q&A. I can read that out loud for you. Andres Silva is asking, how did the show at MoMA personally embrace Blackness in architecture?
So basically there were 10 exhibitors. The show is called Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, and each of the 10 people approached it in a different way. We were each assigned a city. My city was Los Angeles, and I had just moved there, and I wanted to study Los Angeles. I wanted to study Los Angeles because in my previous research, like that I'd done, Los Angeles seemed really different as a city. Like, I was doing this research like throughout the 2000s, and it seemed like Los Angeles was the 21st century city and all the other cities were the 20th century city. And so it just seemed really great to look at that now. And by 21st century city, the diversity of the population and the kind of, yeah, like that's something I think that more cities, American cities, are having to deal with now, but Los Angeles was a city that had that in a very strong way in the 20th century as well. So let's see. So the way that I looked at it was looking at the Reconstruction period in the United States, you know, through the lens of Los Angeles. And I think each person looked at it very differently. I would say some of the projects were very specifically geared toward looking at the future, like they weren't looking at the past. They were all about futurity and the future. And then there were projects that looked at maybe like more specific, were very much about the place, and projects that were maybe about like a social phenomena like the kitchen, or sociality around the house and the kitchen being the center, that kind of thing. So each person really developed their own way of relating to the theme, the larger theme of Reconstruction's architecture and Blackness in America, and what might it mean, or what might it be to look at Blackness in architecture. The prompts were given by Sean Anderson, who is the curator for the Issues in Contemporary Architecture series, and Mabel Wilson, who is like a co-curator with him on this show.
Thank you, Yolande. And the second question by Akam Singh, speaking of abstractions and representations, especially in housing projects, what are some of the tangible architectural elements that you have found in your practice?
Okay. Let's see, that question is slightly abstract to me. Like, I think there's something more tangible in the question that I might not be understanding. But I think that in terms of like the housing that we've designed, I would say in general, like tangible things. A lot of what we've designed has been in like either a Japanese context, ironically, or like if it was domestic or on a building on a larger scale, or it was in an art context in this country. And the art context was always kind of posing questions and maybe doing the work of unbuilding as opposed to building, which we were doing in our practice. And I think one of the things, one of the things that's to us that stands out about what we've built is a way that our buildings open up to the landscape and kind of engage it. So in both small and large ways. So all of the projects in Japan, we've also designed the landscape, and many of them we design all, if not, most of the furniture that goes in it. And so there's this way of designing at multiple scales in the tangible projects. And so this idea of like opening up and having more fluidity between the environment and the building is something that we're really engaged in the housing project that we designed, the double corridor. So it's a footprint of a single loaded corridor building because that's the most efficient and the cheapest construction. But then it's also like, in a way, you could say like not the most humane, but by adding, like doubling the corridor and making a kind of outdoor space and an indoor, and then having this fluidity between the two, it made it more humane. It kind of opened it up to the outside, which in the context of Tokyo and Japan is more common to do, and also in Los Angeles, where the climate is more, temperate, where you can open up inside and outside and you don't have to have this totally sealed barrier. But I think like what it presented for us, this way of working, is really just rethinking the relationship of buildings to the environment. And I would say more than, the units, we started with the units, trying to make them more in like a kind of a model that had, you know, living spaces around a kind of shared, almost like a tatami room, which we liked, but it wasn't like efficient enough, even though it was a nice space to have, you know, these kind of stacked living spaces, dormitory living around a more communal space, which I think what's really interesting about housing, teaching housing and designing housing, is how in housing you can actually really propose different ways for people to live, like different models for living. And I think I actually think that's really radical about housing. I've been on so many housing reviews where, especially now where people are looking at co-living and co-working, and basically a lot of these schemes, you would have to rethink capitalism to really, you know, the schemes are very challenging, this whole idea of co-living, co-working, and it's really interesting sitting on reviews now. But anyway, even for our Japanese client, the idea of this communal space, dollars won over in the end, not, you know, the kind of like quality of the lifestyle or the space. It ended up being more like classic dormitory in the end. So I think I've learned a lot, you know, from these works, and some of the tangibles we've been able to implement, and some we'll just keep trying to implement.
Thank you, Yolande. Is there, I want to be mindful of the time as well. Is there any perhaps last question from our panelists or the audience? If you're willing to take one more, Yolande.
I don't want to be the only one to ask questions. If there's someone else that had one.
Go ahead, Reggie.
Housing is like a particular interest of mine, and I find it really interesting how you're commenting on how to propose alternative ways to live, you almost have to question capitalism. And that linking back to what you're talking about in these situations where people weren't allowed to own anything. They weren't allowed to own the places where they lived, and it's still the case in for a large part of our population. Although it's an option now, it's voluntary if you ignore the capitalist issues with being able to afford things. And I'm just curious how all this links in with, like, maybe there are ways to think about money and restructuring how we assign value to housing and to property, materialism, in the way that we live, so that we can achieve this. I mean, there are other places where housing is a lot less of there's not an American dream in most of Europe. You know, it's not like everybody wants to own a house there. It's not a symbol of achievement the way that it is in this country. I don't really know exactly what the question is, but
well, in a sense, what you're saying, I guess for me, this discussion makes me think about the prompt that you were given, because I thought, you know, the prompt is really powerful, and just, you know, all the things that, as a result of COVID and the pandemic, that these things that, you know, were never dues that were done, and they were done really quickly because something had to be done, right? So even the fact that we're like on Zoom and that you're learning architecture remotely, like that was a never do, right? Like that was something that couldn't be done before. And so so I'm kind of thinking about, you know, from the importance of the environment and climate change to, the way that we've had to kind of open up to the outside because we had to, because it was healthier. So just rethinking the sealing of interiors, there are so many levels that life had to change because it was forced upon us during COVID. So in some ways, I think the question that you're asking, if you ask it within the context of these other things, so like, questions about property, land ownership, building ownership. And I think that was where my comment about how housing is radical came from, because, the students are looking at these issues now in light of how things have changed in COVID, right? So you're a different generation than me, right? Like this didn't happen to me when I was a young person. And so then it's for you, these are examples of how things could actually change and be thought of in a different way, concrete examples. In addition to, like how people live in other countries,
Beautiful. May I ask one maybe last question about representation, and given the complexity of the mapping and the multi-layer approach that spans across a large timeline and also geographically complex, what may be some tips or tools or suggestions how to map such complex? Is overlay extending this? I guess in your MoMA exhibit, this timeline sets an order that can stretch along a long line. How do you deal with these overlaps and complexities through mapping specifically?
Yeah. Well, I think like what you talked about, this extending line, I mean, that's something I wanted to extend more in the installation. Like I kind of felt like there's this datum that the lines could produce when you're there. But I think that each project is kind of different. So I think the timeline itself was very just, the linearity of the timeline. And I was actually looking at Charles Jenks' evolution of architecture drawings, which I've, like for this Black City project, I've been looking at them forever. And it's this way because he maps both social and formal together in his critique of architecture. So it's the book, Architecture 2000 Predictions of the Future. It's one of my favorite books, where he kind of uses scientific methods to project the future in architecture. But, he looks historically at architecture movements, but he looks at them in context of, what's happening in the world. And, his kind of psychedelic mapping exercises where he has these blobby forms before the word blob was used, but they're about showing how different things influence other things. So it's not this kind of linear way of seeing history and forms and movements. They're more, it's like, lava lamp kind of things bumping into other things and influencing. And so visually, like that's in the back of my head when I'm working on this, even if what I'm producing doesn't look anything like it. And so the timeline itself with its kind of rigid structure, there are two versions of it that we've done. One is the more standard timeline and the other is a collapsed timeline, where one side, like say, is events and movements, but then you can collapse movements over events to get something more like this field of influences being shown. So this is a way of trying to think of strategies. So drawing from the timeline, it's standard strategies, and then what can you do? You have horizontal, what happens if you make something vertical? What happens if you make it horizontal, vertical? Then what happens if you overlap it? Just developing from something known to something which is unknown. In the game that I mentioned, that looked at public accommodations, the mapping there started with, so it was about public accommodations. So it looked at specifically the trains. So it was looking at trains that, the Great Migration, as it's called, of African Americans fleeing the South to the North and then Midwest and West. It largely happened along train routes. And so what we looked at was the iconography of train lines. So trains have this, they have lines. So it's like looking at the train lines, but then the notation for the operation of the trains, like splitting. We kind of came up with this whole catalog based on the notation of the instructions for how trains perform. So, the way that the lines split or the way the line breaks, which then we kind of translated into loops. And of course, there are solid lines and dotted lines to show, more kind of temporal relationships. So the maps in that project were all informed by the mapping of the laws were informed by the iconography of the trains. And so that's where that project was very different from the Los Angeles project. And then also I look a lot at the way data is represented. So like looking at data is represented as, demographic data is represented as dots that are like bigger if there is more quantity, smaller if there is less. So these kind of like dot maps or graphs, like bar maps or bar charts. So I look a lot at other forms of representation in other fields. The book, I can't remember the title, Edward Tufte. He did a series on graphic representation that when I was first looking at the Black City and trying to figure out how to represent things, I was looking at, these kind of two-dimensional methods for representing in those books. Another really interesting series of drawings is Pablo Picasso has these dash line drawings that he did that are really beautiful, that most people don't even, I think, know exists, but it's like the series of drawings he did just using dash lines. And those are really nice. Even Gordon Matta Clark did a series of drawings with arrows. His are crazy, the drawings with the arrows. Like in school, I always try to shift students away from using arrows, but he uses so many arrows that it's successful, right? So you just kind of like only use arrows and then it starts to work. But there are other artists who also have done like even much better use of only arrow drawings than him. So I guess basically for every project, there's a certain amount of graphic research that I do with how to represent, as well as, the social and the formal kind of model making and testing.
Thank you, Yolanda. This is very informative. And I'm very much enjoying the conversation, that we had enough time to get deeper into this exchange. Ronnie responds, so interesting that you use the more classic information visualization vocabulary, plus extrapolating from Picasso, and also coming up with completely innovative ways to represent 4D, almost time and space information visualization vocabulary. On that note, I would like to thank you, Yolande, and thank everyone who is joining us today. Thank you very much. There is a lot of information to unpack and resources to reach out to. Thank you very much for this experience.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes.
Again, thank you for the questions. They were really good questions. Thanks, Reggie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck with your projects.
You're very welcome, and so is our audience to join us for the final presentations when our residents come up with a design project for the Hudson Valley. That is coming up on Tuesday. What is it, Max? It's the 27th, right? The 27th, in exactly 2 weeks from today. So Yolande, you're welcome to join, and there will be additional information on our website about how to register to join that.